Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone is having a good day today. Happy Friday. It's the last day before we go off into the weekend, so I hope everyone gets some good rest and is able to enjoy their weekend. And hopefully you guys go to homecoming because it's going to be really, really fun. Now, at this time, make sure you guys have your journals out and get ready to take some notes over today's lesson. But before we get started, I do want to warn you guys beforehand that this lesson is going to be a little bit on the longer hand. Um, and I will try to keep it as short as possible, but we're going to cover a whole lot of information today, right? And now, based off of your readings, you will know that today's lesson is going to be over society in antebellum America, right? And the different reform movements, right? And when we hear the word antebellum, that is referring to the United States before the Civil War, right? Remember that everything we've been talking about um, has been leading up to the tensions that caused the Civil War in the 1860s, right? And we've been talking about a variety of things like that. So anytime you hear the word antebellum, it's referring to before the Civil War. So before we get into the specifics of today's lesson, I wanted to go ahead and show y'all this timeline. I know many of us are visual learners and it's easier for us to learn when we see things being put together. So I went ahead and created this overview of period 4, right? This time period that we've been studying this whole time. Now this black line right here, this is our timeline, right? So this would begin in 1800 to the end of the 19th century, right? The late 1800s, right? And so far, when we began talking about period 4, we began talking about the era of good feelings that happened. And then right after that would be the Jacksonian era. But it's important to understand that when we spoke about the market revolution, every little detail regarding the industrial and market revolution that is going to occur at the same time as the era of good feelings and the Jacksonian era. And the same is going to apply to all of the information we learned about slavery in the southern states, right? That is also going to happen at the same time as the market revolution is happening and at the same time of the era of good feelings in the Jacksonian era. And lastly, these last two little lines here, those are going to represent the information we're going to talk about today. So today we're going to talk about the changes that we see in women's roles, but most importantly, we're going to talk about the reform movements and how the culture in the United States is changing or has changed, especially towards the end of the 19th century. And now these changes in these reform movements, they're really going to be caused by one thing, and that thing is going to be the Second Great Awakening. Now, the Second Great Awakening, we must remember that it is a reaction against the rationalist belief that was going on during the Enlightenment, right? Remember, this is your Second Great Awakening, meaning that the first one already happened. And just as a slight little refresher, the Great Awakening happened when people had this new reconnection to their faith, right? To their religion, right? So the Second Great Awakening is essentially them doing that again, right? And we saw that during the Enlightenment movement, some people did not really, they didn't like having to reason their actions using religion. So the Enlightenment was more based off reason and science to justify human action, right? And that's going to lead to the belief of people having free will, which is then going to encourage the American Revolution, right? But as a result of this rationalist belief, some people are going to dislike it and want to return back to, reconnecting and rekindling their faith, right? And so these that are a part of the Second Great Awakening movement, they're going to have more liberal type thinking, right? And it's going to challenge some of the traditional views. And we're even going to see a rise of a whole new belief system that's called deism, right? Now, deism is a belief that there is a God, but organized religion was nothing but a myth, meaning that any religion that exists at this time, all of their little rules, that shouldn't exist, but they do at the end of the day believe that there is a God. And so with this rise of people reconnecting with religion in the Second Great Awakening, we're going to see a lot of women become strong supporters of this movement, and it's even going to inspire them to promote change in America. Now, women, they're going to be very, very important to all of these reform movements, right? And they're essentially not going to lead, but be very influential in the beginnings of movements such as the temperance reform movement, the suffrage movement, and of course, the abolition movement, right? Which we'll talk about later in this video. But since people are having this reconnection in their belief system, right, this reconnection in religion, the way that they spread their faith was slightly different, right? So the Second Great Awakening beliefs is going to spread through what's known as camp meetings, which is essentially when people would gather in an encampment for several days to drink the gospel, meaning that they would stay in one area, essentially camping for multiple days, just practicing and talking about their religion and their faith, right? And so the Second Great Awakening, since it's a little bit more liberal and it challenges some of the traditional views, it's also going to be slightly controversial, right? And really, their most prominent preacher at the time was a man named Charles G. Finney, right? And he was one of the biggest preachers during the Second Great Awakening. But he himself is going to be a little controversial, right? One of the biggest things that he's controversial for is that he is an abolitionist, right? Meaning that he's going to advocate for the immediate freeing of every slave in the United States, right? And for most, that's going to be controversial. But Charles G. Finney is also going to participate in a lot of different methods in spreading the word, right? He's going to have these new measures. One thing that he does as a preacher is that when he's having a church service, he's going to practice public praying of women in mixed sex audiences, meaning that his services and any other public speaking that he does, he's going to welcome women and he's going to preach to both men and women in the audience. And something else that he does that's a little controversial is that he uses colloquial language when he's preaching, meaning that when he preaches, he is not going to use big words or like big terms that people wouldn't understand. He's going to use the common everyday language, right? He's going to use some of the slang, and he's going to preach in a way that it's easy for people to understand instead of sticking to the more structured language that typically comes from a Bible. And on top of that, he's going to be a little controversial because when he prays for people, he's going to pray for them by name, meaning he's going to use their name specifically, which is not something that he does often. But arguably, one of the most controversial things that he does as a preacher during the Second Great Awakening is that he's going to allow the immediate membership of new converts to the church, meaning any new person who is finding the religion for the first time, he's immediately going to accept them in their church and they're going to be a part of the church population. And now what makes this a little bit bigger than normal is that at the time, in order to become a part of the church, you would have to show loyalty, you would have to be persistent, and you would have to be showing interest in the church consistently for a while. And he didn't require that. He just said, okay, if you are converting to my religion and you would like to join my church, I accept you. So that's just to name a few things of the Second Great Awakening overall. But it's very, very important to understand the differences between the First Great Awakening and the Second. While yes, they both deal with people reconnecting to their religion, the way in which they do that is very different. Now, the First Great Awakening, it's really going to focus on the idea that humans are sinful in nature, right? That they don't have the ability to change, and when they sin, the only person that can save them is God, right? They have to repent, but they have to do so in a way that only God can accept and only God can forgive you. However, the Second Great Awakening, that's going to be more individual based, right? It's going to be individually controlled, right? They are going to agree that people are sinful in nature, but they believe that humans have the ability to change their behavior, right? They are going to believe that instead of God granting you salvation, you as the individual, you as the person, have the ability to save yourself. They stressed personal accountability, meaning that people have free will and they have the ability to recognize when they're sinning and ask for forgiveness and do any action necessary to save themselves. So this is really going to spread and expand religion to people because it's really giving power to the people, right? Because if you think about it this way, you have one option that is saying, you as a human, you are bad, and the only way you can be forgiven for your badness is that God has to forgive you. That's option one. Option two is you as a human are bad, but you have the opportunity to change and you can do it. Meaning that if you do, you can save yourself through your actions, right? And so when given those two options, people are really going to go with the second one, right? Because it's giving them the power to control their own salvation. And so as a result of the Second Great Awakening, it's going to have a huge impact on people. It's going to dramatically increase church attendance, right? Now that it is expanding Christianity and really providing a lot of people the opportunities to save themselves through this salvation practices, right? But it's also opening up the church to people of different backgrounds, right? So it's going to provide women a safe area to publicly participate within the church. But it's also going to emphasize the spread of this religion to the slaves and even emphasize the importance of doing missionary work and spreading the religion and faith to the Native Americans and any and every immigrant coming from the foreign nations. But most of all, the biggest impact that the Second Great Awakening is going to have is that it's going to spawn all of these reform movements that we're about to talk about, right? Meaning, now that people have this belief that they are able to save themselves, well, now they're going to try to attempt at changing society, right? Changing society in an attempt to perfect the individual now that they have the power. And so I'm about to run through a variety of very important reform movements that we see during this time period. And now each of these reform movements are not necessarily going to be connected to each other, but they are each just as important to society and the development of the social culture. So the first reform movement to come out of this, or the first reform movement that we're going to talk about, is this one that's a really big word. It is pronounced transcendentalism, right? Now, transcendentalism is going to be a reaction to the Enlightenment. And it's mostly going to be composed of artists and writers. And these artists and writers are really going to question all of these doctrines, all of these rules that are being established by the church. But they're even also going to question the business practices of the merchant class, really focusing and challenging materialism. Now, materialism, if you don't know what that is when people focus on all of the material wealth, all the physical wealth that we have, right? So they focus on celebrating the physical money that they have, all of the goods that they own, right? Um, all of these little things that they own, right? So these transcendentalists, they're really going to challenge this idea, saying you really shouldn't focus on all of the things that you own. You should focus on yourself and being a good person rather than everything that you own, right? So some of their key beliefs are going to be that they value individualism, right? That you should become your own person and really protect yourself. They're going to value artistic expression much more than any wealth, right? They're going to care more about the expression of people than any type of money. And they're going to say statements like the role of the reformer was to restore man to that divinity which God had endowed on them, meaning that the role of the person is to restore themselves to the divine goodness that God gave to them, right? And so there's going to be a lot of very important figures that were transcendentalists. Some of the most important key figures would be Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a writer, and also Henry David Thoreau. And so these transcendentalists, they are going to have their own agenda they're going to try to push, since they're challenging this materialism of people, right? One of their agendas, or their agenda, is going to list the following things. As a transcendentalist, they're going to believe that you should give freedoms to the slaves, right? They're going to be abolitionists, just like many other people during this time period, during this reform time period. Another thing on their agenda is that they're going to believe that they should give well-being to the poor and the miserable, meaning that if you are able and you have the resources, you should help those in need. They're also going to value giving learning to the ignorant, meaning that they're going to believe in the right and the ability to educate others. They're also going to believe that we should give health to the sick, right? Any person that is sick, we should help them get healthy again. But lastly, the transcendentalist is really going to push for giving peace and justice to society, right? Making sure that everyone is equal at the time. Outside of the transcendentalist movement, another reform that we're going to see at this time is called the temperance movement, right? Now, the temperance movement is going to be focused on alcohol. Since these people are reconnecting to their religion, they're going to realize that there is a high rate of alcohol consumption happening in society, right? And since they're reconnecting to religion, they know that one of the biggest sins named in the Bible is that a person should not get drunk, right? And so when they see this high rate of alcohol consumption, people are going to start targeting alcohol as a cause for all of the social problems that is happening in the world, right? They're going to say alcohol is the cause of your sin. So if you remove it, you won't sin as much anymore. So the temperance movement is going to be the most popular of the reform movements at this time, right? One of the key figures, the father of prohibition, is going to be a man named Neil S. Dow, and him and the rest of the temperance movement people are going to gather together and lead to the creation of the American Temperance Society. And now what this society does is that they are going to try to persuade drinkers to pledge abstinence, right? Trying to get them to promise and pledge, saying that they will stop drinking alcohol and they will not do it anymore. Now, a lot of people are not going to be happy about this movement, right? People really enjoy their alcohol. Specifically, the German and the Irish immigrants are going to be one of the biggest opposers of this movement, right? They really like their alcohol. However, this reform movement is going to be, again, incredibly popular in the United States. That in 1851, the state of Maine is going to create a law that prohibits the manufacture and sale of liquor, right? And they're going to be the first state to do so. And eventually, over time, this temperance movement is going to gain a lot of popularity to the point that it's going to gain support from a majority of people, and it's going to lead to the establishment of the 18th Amendment of the Constitution in 1919, which is going to establish prohibition and stop the manufacture and sale of liquor all over the country. But when we won't get to talk about prohibition until we get to the 1920s, which is some time from now. But it's important to know that the temperance movement really began here, this idea of targeting alcohol. Outside of the temperance movement, another reform that we see at this time is going to be the women's rights movement, right? And remember, I said that women, they're going to become very important during this time period, and they're going to start calling for their own rights, right? And this is going to be because of the impact of the Industrial Market Revolution, right? We saw that with the creation of the Industrial Revolution, we saw the rise of the middle class, and with that rise, we saw gender roles within families being changed, right? Which led to the creation of the cult of domesticity, which was this view of women being these moral leaders, right? And being a caretaker at their house, right? Providing for their families, providing for their husbands, being submissive, and overall a morally correct person, right? They had an image to protect. But some women, they're not going to like these restrictions, and they're going to start calling for some rights, right? Especially when it comes to education, because women at this time were not allowed to receive an education. So women are going to go and create what's known as the Republican motherhood, which means that once they became mothers, or as a woman who is a mother, they're going to start arguing that women need to become educated and to become a part of the educated society in order for them to raise educated sons and encourage them to become voters and active members of society, right? Essentially arguing the idea of hitting two birds with one stone, saying it makes more sense for you to educate the women, and now that women are educated, they can take what they learn and teach the men of society to become good people. So this idea of Republican motherhood is going to lead to the beginnings of the early rights movement, right? Especially in the 1840s. And remember that many of these women, they're going to be abolitionists. And some of the most important ones are going to be women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. But this movement, this idea that women need to be educated and become equal to men, well, it's going to gather a lot of popularity to the point that in 1848, women are going to come together and meet at the Seneca Falls Convention. There, at Seneca Falls, they're going to produce the Seneca Falls Declaration, or the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And what these women do at this convention is when they write this declaration, they're going to model it after the Declaration of Independence that was written by Thomas Jefferson, right? And they're even going to change some of the wording, right? Meaning that in the Declaration of Independence, they're going to change it from saying all men are created equal to saying all men and women. And now why this is important is because this is going to be the first open declaration for women's suffrage in the United States. It's going to be the first time that women come together, organize themselves, and really call for their rights, their right to education and their right to vote. However, women's rights is going to be overshadowed by the crisis of slavery, right? But at least the movement is there. Now, another reform that happened during this time period at the same time is going to be the education reform movement. Now, the education reform movement, very differently from the others, can actually be broken into three subsections, right? Their whole focus was on establishing free public schools for children, right? Especially children of all classes, because remember, up until this point, if you wanted an education, you had to pay for it. So with this, people are going to call for the first section, which is the free common schools movement, right? It's going to be led by a man named Horace Mann, and he's going to be the leading advocate of the public school movement, meaning he's going to advocate for creating schools available for young kids. This movement of the free common schools is going to move on and influence the moral education movement, which is going to be led by William H. McGuffey, who is going to create a series of elementary textbooks, right? Some of the first textbooks created that are going to be widely used to teach children how to read, but also teach them morality. So in these textbooks, it's going to include information on the morals that are accepted by society, meaning, it's bad to lie, it's bad to kill, it's bad to steal, you should respect people, so on and so forth. But the last education reform movement is going to be focused on higher education. And when you hear that term higher education, it is talking about colleges, right? So here, due to the Second Great Awakening, we're going to see a growth in private colleges, especially in the newer Western states. But it's also during this time where we're going to see the beginnings of some colleges admitting women, which is going to be a huge stepstone for women. Lastly, the final reforms that we're going to talk about today are going to be two that we mixed into one, right? And that's going to be the movement for public asylums and prison reforms. Now, this is going to be because people are going to see how those who were emotionally disturbed or mentally ill, they're going to be treated terribly in the asylums that they're in. But also the prisoners are going to be treated terribly. So those that saw this terrible treatment, they're going to propose setting up new institutions that are going to be state funded and state supported, right? Both prisons and mental hospitals, right? And they're going to call for the states to start creating these. And a key figure of this is going to be a woman named Dorothea Dix, who we see here in this image. And she is going to be the loudest person calling for these new institutions to be set up because she was a former school teacher, right? And she's going to go across the country and launch a cross-country publication that exposes the awful treatment that she witnessed when she went to go view these public asylums and prison farms. But I understand that there is a lot of other reforms. There's even a few that I didn't speak about today. And I know it's very difficult to keep up with all of these reform movements that are happening at the same time, right? It's really difficult to track them. So what you guys are going to do today for your independent practice is that I have created a graphic organizer for you that lists all of the reform movements that are happening during this time period. After you're done watching this video and taking notes, you will have the rest of class to work on completing this graphic organizer. Now, this graphic organizer, it does not have to be in complete sentences. You can write it in bullet points, but make sure you're going through and you're writing out the important key figures at this time. What reform did they try to achieve? Were they successful? And so on and so forth. If you do not finish, which most likely you won't, it is homework. And the good thing about this graphic organizer is that when you work on it over the weekend, it will help you study for your period 4 exam that's going to take place on Tuesday. Now on Tuesday, make sure that since we have a period 4 exam, that you bring your charged Chromebook to class, because your exam is going to be online like the previous exam. So make sure you bring your charged Chromebooks. Again, if at any point you need any additional help, please let me know. A copy of your period 4 study guide is on Schoology already, but if you also need a new physical one, let me know and I will give that to you. And of course, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. Now, I hope you guys have a good rest of your day, have a good weekend, get some rest, and study for your exam. Bye!